Nashville, Tennessee, indeed, the Athens of the South. Um, and right now it's just you and me, B. Rogers. So what do you want to hear about? Now we got Clay Foster from College Station, Texas. We're up to two people. Dublin, Ohio, Boise, Idaho. Oh, now everybody's coming in. Hey, Kristen. Um, Danny Smart from Richland, Washington. I have missed you on these talks. Kansas City, Missouri, Winter Garden, Florida, Kinsdale, Virginia, Gig Harbor, Washington, North Carolina, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, New Jersey, California, Perth, New York, Carruthers, California, Worcester, Mass. Okay, we are good to go. So, have we lived through a year this week or what? Right? So I'm going to try and cover a lot of your questions today. I do want to acknowledge that we are in an extraordinarily choppy time. And somebody wrote to me today and said that, you know, they were sort of tired of navigating um, the choppiness of it all and feeling like, well, maybe somebody like me provides some unraveling of what's happening and some ground under your feet that's we're kind of over that. We need something more to do. And I would like to identify this week, again, not knowing what's going to come, but this week as having been a really important turning point for the United States of America, because the president's threat on Tuesday to destroy a civilization unless it did what he wanted to was, of course, the threat of genocide from the United States of America. And I think there was actually an important thread in that as well that I hope to pick up in a minute. That terrorized not just the rest of the world, but also Americans who were afraid of their own government because of what it was threatening to do, both to the rest of the world, but also what they were threatening to do to our democratic government at home. And the fact that most members of Congress on the Republican side didn't say anything, didn't do anything, suggested that there really is no level to which Donald Trump can stoop that they won't accept. Because when you are threatening to annihilate another country, another civilization, as he said, like what would it take? I mean, it's bad enough that they've gone along this far, but the fact they were willing to gamble with the dice that Trump was not going to fulfill his threat, at least at that point, was an extraordinary indictment of the current Republican Party. And again, I want to emphasize here that if you are somebody with an R by your name, as appalled as everybody else is by what the administration is doing, you're very welcome here. You know that I wrote a history of the Republican Party and have argued in a number of places that it has in its past been a grand party at times. There was a reason they called it the Grand Old Party. But it is long past time to start working to take that back, to recreate that party, and to push the MAGA Republicans, who are radical extremists trying to usher in a fascist government in the United States and authoritarian governments around the world, out of your party and to take it back. So I would argue that this week has been a turning point, and a turning point not just in that we are very clear on what we are facing now, but also that I don't know about you, and maybe I am speaking here mostly for myself, but for me, a door slammed on Tuesday. And what I'm really going to be focusing on going forward is certainly the politics of this moment, but also what we do to change this moment. What are the politics of the future? And on that, because as I always say, historians don't predict the future, we predict the past. I'm not always going to be right. But what I can do is I can give you the tools you need to feel like you've got skin in the game and that you're not helpless. Because really, at the end of the day, this is what all of this is about, is the idea of fighting to create and to preserve a nation that is based in the idea of human self-determination. And that both requires and justifies the idea that we have agency to change the future. So if you're feeling frustrated and you feel like, it's just more of the same all the time, okay. But there are a lot of signs that the world is changing. And let me start there with them today. And I'll get into what happened today, which is just bonkers. Um, because I think that may give you some hope. Do remember that every special election that has been held since Donald Trump won office in 2024 has shown remarkable movement away from Trump and toward the Democrats. And that includes on Tuesday, when in the district that Marjorie Taylor Greene used to represent in deep Georgia, which is extraordinarily gerrymandered. So a Republican held that seat, but the Republican held that seat after a 25-point shift from the Republicans toward the Democrats. That was an extraordinary shift. And a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin who supports progressive values won a seat in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And that means that Supreme Court is going to be a progressive Supreme Court or a liberal Supreme Court until at least 2030. And Wisconsin actually tells us a lot about how you change the national conversation, because they're very deliberately, the chair of the Wisconsin Democrats, the former chair, Ben Wickler, was really careful to build from the ground up early on and enable the building from the ground up changes things at the local level, and then it changed things at the state level, and that in turn changed things at the Supreme Court. I mean, it's at the state court level, the state Supreme Court level, so that they were able to push back on gerrymandering and unwind a lot of the things that the Republicans had put in place since 2010. He's got a new book either coming out or out. I don't remember which. I read it. I thought it was great. And you might find that somewhat hopeful in terms of figuring out what you do next to try and change things on the ground. But that's not the only thing that feels like it's changing, and not the only place that we are seeing a real change in the politics of this country. Another one is in the extraordinary unpopularity of Donald Trump and of the Republicans. And one of the statistics. And again, polls are iffy over a lot of things, and it's always worth looking to see who they're polling and what exactly they're polling. But one of the people I recommend you follow is G. Elliott Morris with Strength in Numbers, or Tom Bonier, Bonier, who's also a very good pollster. And what I like about the two of them is that they explain what they're doing and why, and they look at other polls and give you information about how they're done, so that you have a good sense of not how the next election is going to go, but what the country is feeling like, what the country looks like in this moment. And where the momentum is in this country right now is in favor of those people who are trying to protect democracy. Now, once again, this is not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination, and I'll get into that now. But if you're feeling like this is horrible, we're never going to come out of this, as I keep saying, I feel better about the country now than I did 10 years ago, when a lot of us saw many of these pieces coming and no one cared. No one paid any attention. And that the idea that so many of us now care is incredibly important for changing the conversation. But you can also see it playing out in things, and this will continue going forward, with the number of Republican members of Congress who are not running for re-election. Now, the reason that they are not running for re-election might be because they think they're going to lose. That could be too. But often what you look for in this, in a moment like this, for resignations or for ceasing to stand for office in the majority party, like there's a reason that the people in the minority party step down, but in the majority party, one of the reasons that people step down is they don't want to go back to being if they've been running a committee, they don't want to go back to being a ranking member. They don't want to step backward. So instead, they'll step out. And this is kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole, but one of the reasons I'm really interested in committees like the Committee on the Judiciary or the appropriations committees is because those committees, if you're on those committees, you tend to stay on those committees and be willing to drop back to ranking member, both because you have real power as ranking member. The ranking member, remember, is the top member of the opposing party in a committee, but also because it's such a powerful committee, you're willing to be out of power or out of the chair seat for a while, because if your party comes back in, you'll get elected back to the top of it again, and those are really prime seats. So one of the things that was really interesting about this Congress was the degree to which the Republicans, who had finally gotten control of seats in the Appropriations Committee, for example, in the Senate, which is Susan Collins from Maine, she's waited her whole career for that. And to watch Trump take that away, basically take it away from her and take all the power to himself, and to have her sort of go, oh, he's not supposed to do that, is a real sign of just how willing the Republicans have become to let Trump do anything he wants. So watch the resignations, but we now have more resignations, I believe, from the Republicans as the majority party in the House of Representatives. I believe we've got the most, not resignations, I'm sorry, I shouldn't use that word, most we're not going to run for reelection that we've ever had in American history. That many of them are like, oopsie poopsie, we are getting out of here. So you can see the momentum changing, but there's a lot of other things going on as well. And now I'm going to answer the questions that you asked about, the many questions that you had, and I will try to put them into some kind of order. But an awful lot happened this afternoon, and I think we are being set up for a lot of things happening on the weekend. So remember that Friday night is the infamous Friday night news dump, because after like 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock Friday night, the news broadcast news tends kind of to be on a weekend schedule, so it's much harder for breaking news to get out to the American public. So the Trump administration often drops stuff after 5 o'clock on Friday, and of course he's been messing with the stock market, so he does a lot over the weekend that way. But there's also just a ton of stuff happening all of a sudden right now, so I think we're going to see more and more stuff. I want to start with where should we start? I guess we should start with Iran and what's happening in Iran. Now, that's another example of a place where the administration under Trump decided to execute what Trump thought would be sort of a decapitation strike in Iran that looked much like the strike in Venezuela in January, in which there'd be a quick round of bombing, that they would kill the existing Ayatollah, hope that he would be replaced with somebody more moderate, and then get out. And, Trump appeared to be hoping for a bump in his approval ratings, and this would be, he could blow some stuff up, and, the American military, and there's that theme that I want to pick up again. The American military would look all powerful, and there was not, in his mind anyway, a downside to that. Well, of course, not at all how it played out. And what happened was, just as every strategist expected would happen, Iran promptly began to strike at neighboring countries and close the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil travels, and more of that of liquid natural gas, and also the ingredients for fertilizer, about 30% of the world's fertilizer, which is a huge problem because we need that fertilizer. That's another story that I'm not going to go down. But this is where we ended up on Tuesday, with Trump announcing that unless Iran did what he told them to, which is to open the strait, that he was going to annihilate their civilization. And that's in part because all the other countries he tried to bully into reopening the strait were like, dude, it's not our problem. We didn't do this. You did. So on Tuesday, he said he was either going to there be a great solution, or he was going to destroy a civilization. And we know that about 6:30 that evening, Trump put on social media that, oh, look, we have a ceasefire, a 2-week ceasefire, and they're going to reopen the strait, and they have this great 10-point plan, and all the bombing's going to stop, and everything's just going to be fine. Isn't this great? And then since then, he has posted a number of times really contradictory stuff. So he posted that first social media post at about 6:32, if I recall correctly, which I might not, by the way, but 6:32 is in my mind. And what was interesting about that was that it really seemed very clear that he had manufactured a scenario in which he could simply declare victory and quit, because Iran was not going to budge over the Strait of Hormuz because it gave them leverage. And Trump was in way over his ears on this one. And so he just declared victory. But what was interesting about that was part of that agreement, as it was presented, both by the leader of Pakistan, the negotiations leader of Pakistan, but also at the time of American officials, was that Israel would stop bombing the Hezbollah in Lebanon as well, because Israel during all this has been just flattening southern Lebanon. And what has happened since then is Israel said, no, we're not covered by this. We're not going to stop. So Israel has continued to bomb Lebanon. And Iran has said, well, if Israel's not covered, we're not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. So it closed the Strait of Hormuz again. And yesterday, Trump said, somebody asked about the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, because that 10-point plan that Trump said was, fine with him, had one point after another. It was the maximalist demands from Iran, and it included the fact that they would have control over the Strait of Hormuz, and that this wasn't in the plan, this was part of the understanding of the plan, that they would be able to charge tolls going through the Strait of Hormuz at $2 million a pop. And there's all kind of discussion of whether that meant that they would keep it or they would split it with Oman, or, what was going to happen. Well, yesterday, Trump said, oh, yeah, we're going to be part of that. We're going to take a cut of that. We're going to be partners with them, which is what he's been saying. He said on Wednesday, we're going to have this great golden age of Iran, and we're going to be hanging out. He actually wrote that the U.S. is going to be hanging out to be part of rebuilding Iran. The 10-point plan also calls for all the sanctions that have been on Iran to be lifted. And again, they were going to be making all this money off the Strait of Hormuz. Well, today, this afternoon, Trump said, I've heard reports that they're charging fees to get through the Strait of Hormuz. They can't do that. They got to stop this. So what you're seeing here is extraordinary weakness, first of all, on Trump's part. He started a war that has put Iran in the driver's seat and dramatically weakened the United States. At the same time, he does not appear to have any idea of what was in the plan or what his positions are on it, because he simply wanted to get out of the war in whatever terms he could. And he sort of, again, was waiting for somebody else to clean up his mess. And Netanyahu was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm still going to continue to bomb Lebanon, where there are more than 1 million refugees, by the way. Now, that's interesting. And I do not have time today to go into the relationship between the United States and Israel. But thinking of Netanyahu as a political issue in Israel and around the world right now, remember that he's on trial for corruption. And that trial for corruption has been halted because of the war in Iran. So he doesn't want the war to stop, because if the war stops, the corruption trial starts again on Saturday. So the willingness of Netanyahu to stop bombing Lebanon is tied into his willingness to go back on trial for corruption, which both he and Trump are trying desperately to get him out of. Trump has been putting enormous pressure on the Israeli president. Remember, Netanyahu is the prime minister, on the president to pardon him. And the president's like, leave me out of this for now. It's got to go through the courts. I'm not taking a stand on this right now. But so this idea that there has been this miraculous ceasefire is falling apart before our eyes right now, where Israel's still in, Iran's still in, the U.S., it's not clear what's going to happen, except Trump said, if you charge us for the Strait of Hormuz again, if you charge people for the Strait of Hormuz, we're going to come in. And I believe he said something like guns a-blazing. So the Iran issue has not gone away. And where we are right now is in the United States is in a significantly worse position than we were on February 27th, 2026. And thousands of innocent people have been killed or wounded in this attack. 13 American servicemen have been killed. And today, a number of the servicemen who were killed, those killed in Kuwait, said that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's suggestion that a squirter had gotten through the defenses over their position was untrue, that in fact they were undefended, is what they told CBS News. So more stories like that are going to come out. And there is, I suspect, more that we don't know about that rescue operation. And I'm operating as blindly as anybody else is. But there are a number of pieces of that explanation that don't really seem to add up. So I think we're going to be hearing more and more coming out of the operation of that war that doesn't reflect well on the administration. And again, we still have not actually seen the price spikes from this more expensive oil coming out, in the world markets, because what people trade in when they trade is in oil futures, and those futures are now becoming the present. They're not here yet. It's going to be within the next week or so. And that, of course, is going to contribute to higher prices around the world, shortages around the world, but also certainly at home. All right, so that's the place to start, but we're not done. So let me see where else. What does this look like? Trump has fallen apart. I mean, please don't forget that. No matter what else happens and what threats he makes, the threats are because he's falling apart. So one of the things that he did today was he went on a long screed on social media attacking his former allies in the MAGA movement, who have turned against him over the Iran war and who are shaky on the grounds of Epstein. And in those attacks, he has done really stupid things. So one of the things that he did in the attack today, which was on Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Alex Jones, formerly of InfoWars, or maybe still, no, I think it's formerly of InfoWars, is he called them out and said, you're washed up, and I didn't want your approval anyway, but I could get it back. And but one of the things he did was he talked about Alex Jones's hoax over the Sandy Hook shootings. You remember that was one of the major things that really pumped up Alex Jones. And Alex Jones, by the way, was a community college dropout who got his start in extreme right-wing that's hard to say, right-wing, never mind, extremist radio after the April, the storming of the compound in it's killing me. Sorry, I can't reach for it, because the thing is, this is how my mind works. The town where this happened was the same town that Doris Miller, the World War II veteran, was from. And so all I can think of right now is Doris Miller, and he had nothing to do with this except he was from the same town. Maybe you guys know what it is. Anyway, he came out and that's where he got a start. And then he really pumped himself up with the idea that the Sandy Hook shootings of those babies, those children in Connecticut, was a hoax. And Trump came out and said it was a hoax. And Trump, of course, has been supporting Jones right up until Jones was instrumental in getting people to go to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol in 2021. So the fact that he is now saying, I knew it was a hoax all along, is, again, not something that is going to help glue that MAGA relationship back together, either with Alex Jones or his many followers as well, where Trump is saying it was always stupid. It was always a hoax, the hoax of the Sandy Hook thing. So he's lashing out in these ways that are self-destructive from a political standpoint, but that also are, there's no filter on them. So he's saying things that are actually not good for the survival of his movement. And he's also contradicting himself, we're going to take some of the pay from the Hormuz Strait. Oh, no, we're not. If you do that, we're going to come and hit you. Wait, they're not supposed to be doing that. I mean, he doesn't seem to know what he has said 1 minute to the next. So that's still going on. But then one of the things that I would urge you to look at, oh, let me actually go in a different direction and then come back. And that's that you asked about the story that the representatives from the Trump administration threatened the Vatican, threatened the Pope in January, after the Pope, who, if you recall, is from Chicago, came, first U.S. Pope, came from Pope from the U.S. After he criticized the Trump administration. And the quote that I pulled to tell you about today was, he said, the representative from the government said, the United States has the military power to do whatever it wants in the world. The Catholic Church had better take its side. Well, there is here this sense that because the U.S. military is the strongest by far in the world, that it's going to be able to take over countries, because that's really what he's been doing, right? Venezuela, and threatening Cuba, and threatening Greenland, and so on, just because of the fact we have this extraordinarily powerful military. But that's actually not how the real world works. The real world works where you're strongest when you have allies, and he's burning those ties up as quickly as he possibly can. But what this does show is a growing alliance between Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, and the people who are in the Putin satellites. So one of the things we've learned over the last few days is that Viktor Orban of Hungary, who's a huge figure on the radical right in the United States, basically said to Putin that he was going to return Hungary to a satellite position to Russia, the way it was under the Soviet Union. He's basically saying, I will, you're going to call the shots here, and I will translate those to Hungary. And what that has meant for Hungarians is they've lost their democracy, and it's been replaced with an authoritarian system in which there's been an attempt to reestablish a patriarchy that keeps immigrants and women in a subordinate position, and that highlights Christianity, and that is extraordinarily corrupt, by the way. And the U.S. right wing has amplified and embraced Orban, with Tucker Carlson doing interviews with him. He's came a number of times to speak at CPAC, which is I always get the name of it wrong. I believe it is the Conservative Political Action Conference, but I could have that acronym wrong. It's known as CPAC. Orban has come to speak here. Orban visited Trump repeatedly. And JD Vance is actually right now in Hungary, or has just been in Hungary, to try and get Orban reelected on April 12th when he's up for reelection. And he is currently underwater in that election, I believe, by 32 points. So his opposition is, going gangbusters. If there is a free and fair election, and there won't be a free and fair election, but if they don't simply steal the election, Orban's going to lose. And that link between all these right-wing authoritarian, extraordinarily corrupt, by the way, figures. I mean, what's in this for them is gigantic sums of money. That loss by Orban would really hurt the radical right in the United States, because they've kept a lot of their supporters on board by selling the idea that they are part of this vanguard of Christianity and patriarchy that's going to take over the globe. And there is this march along with God to do this. And obviously, if they lose that election, that movement is going to be hampered, which is one of the reasons they simply may cheat. And I think speaks very strongly to their determination to make sure that the Republicans win the midterm elections in the United States, because ideologically they have to, or they have to say, oopsie poopsie is giving us a step back here, and we're not really going to move forward as quickly as we thought we were going to. And by the way, it's probably worth mentioning at this point that idea that they're going to sweep over the world exactly echoes the elite slave owners who took who split the United States and tried to create the Confederate States of America. There too, they believed they were a vanguard for the future to create this new slaveholding oligarchy around the world, that would enable them to, do exciting, wonderful things. Anyway, that that axis there is really desperate to lock in their power and to lock in their corruption so that we don't have oversight of where the money is going, of where our tax dollars are going, of, where contracts are going. And this is exactly what you are seeing in places like, obviously, Russia, but also in places like Hungary, and now in the United States as well, with Trump getting all these alternative streams of financing through cryptocurrency, through oil, through all these other different, ways to channel money to him. That axis is desperately trying to hold on to power in this moment. So they're fighting harder and harder. But in the United States, in Hungary, this is unpopular because they see where it goes and they don't like the ties to Putin. In the United States, one of the things that is helping those of us trying to protect democracy is the fact that Trump is falling apart. All right, so as he falls apart, I'm sorry. And this idea that you could force, with this axis, you could force the Catholic Church to do what you were telling it to do is, I think, a sign of their hubris. This idea that they could get away with whatever they wanted and they were the ones going to be running the future. Because the Catholic Church is a powerful institution. And again, that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down. But yes, they did apparently threaten the Vatican. All right. So now I want you to think a little bit about, what does it mean if things are falling apart? Like, a lot of people jumped on board that Trump train, a lot of people. And a lot of people are jumping off, like these Republicans who aren't going to run for office again. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who resigned and is now a critic, which is itself a complicated issue. But if you were in that position and you had out there this entire failure of the Iran war, you had the tariffs that have badly hurt the American economy. You had the Epstein files. I'll get to that in a second. You had the corruption, and corruption is always unpopular in the United States. What are you going to do? Well, if you've committed crimes, you're going to do anything you can to stay in power, because if you don't stay in power, there are going to be hearings and there might be repercussions for that. So if you've committed crimes, you're going to do anything you can to stay in power. Let's just go with that one. And that's worth watching. If people are cheating, doing everything they can to stay in power, it's always worth thinking, well, maybe they're terrified of being out of power. But if you haven't committed crimes, or at least not easily traceable crimes, you're going to be trying to protect your money, right? You're going to be, of course, I always think follow the money, but you're going to be trying to protect your money. Get out, get some, take as much with you, smash and grab, take as much as you can and get out of the country or get out of the limelight and hope that you get away with it. So again, one of the things to be watching going forward is the moves that people are making. Are they clinging to power, or are they backing away and, taking jobs elsewhere or leaving the country or doing whatever? So this brings me, where this is going. This brings me to Melania Trump, who out of the blue today, nobody knew this was coming, including apparently the White House and her husband. Although, if you noticed, he just keeps calling reporters on the phone all the time. Anyway, she walked out from closed doors at the White House and stood behind a podium behind the presidential seal. Nobody is supposed to stand behind the presidential seal. It just isn't done. You're not supposed to do that. And you may remember, after Trump was out of office after 2021, he had sort of a fake presidential seal made for himself that was slightly different. It actually had some of the symbols of fascism on it. But this Melania Trump stood behind the presidential seal, which is such a real slap in the face to our traditions. I'm sorry, I care about that stuff. Maybe I care too much about it, but those guardrails matter, Anyway, I'll stop. She stands behind this seal And she gives a 6-minute speech, which I urge you to watch because everybody kept writing to me and going, man, that was bizarre. And I'm like, well, how bizarre can it be? It's bizarre, let me tell you. And she came out and said that she had never been a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex abuser. Who died in custody when he was awaiting further trial. That there were all these lies circulating about her, and that sisters or whatever you should assume are fake, and that that she would like Congress to hold hearings for the victims and look into this because there were more people involved than just Jeffrey Epstein, and that she was not a friend of Ghislaine Maxwell. And the email that Mrs. Trump wrote to Maxwell, signed "Love Melania," was just normal, casual correspondence. Well, I don't know about that. Anyway, and Ghislaine Maxwell answered her, calling her Sweet Pea, which seems kind of like a term of endearment, right? Anyway, something certainly seems to be up. We seem to be in the moment of, we're going to save, I'm going to save myself however it takes, whatever it takes for me to do. And you got to remember that there does not appear to be any loyalty among anybody in that White House, except Melania Trump seems extraordinarily loyal to her son. But that's all I got. So now we've got that on the table as well. Now, so what does this mean going forward? And I don't mean for the rest of our lives. I mean for the next 3 days. So this is a really good time to continue pressure on all of your electeds, especially the Republicans, but also the Democrats, who did, in fact, you remember, Trump pulled all this when Congress was not in session, and Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, a Republican of Louisiana, is basically not bringing Congress back into session except when he absolutely has to. And just so you know, when I say not in session, that's the way it actually works is Congress meets for a certain amount of time, and that's called the session. So if you read the congressional record, it literally will say 37th session. And so long as that is happening, it is in session. But they go on break. They take a lot of time off, and they take way more than they used to, both because they have to raise money, but also because we have modern transportation, so they can hop on a plane and go home to California, which you couldn't do until after World War II. So, for example, in the 19th century, one of the things that really is a huge issue for American history is that the 38th Congress, it was, I believe, adjourned. That is, they stopped the session and everybody went home on the day of Lincoln's second inaugural, which was March 4th of 1865. And that meant that they literally took their bags and they carpet bags, by the way, often. The reason that we have carpet bags and the reason that people from the North who went to the South were called carpet baggers is because once you had frequent train travel, and fairly easy train travel, you no longer traveled with trunks, which were big and heavy, although some people still did. There's at least one very famous trunk murder in the 1870s. But you needed somehow to carry your bags, and fabric, heavy fabric, it tore pretty easily. So one of the things that the early luggage makers used was carpets. So you had a bag made of carpet. It was a carpet bag. Anyway, that's a bit of a rabbit hole. And if anybody's interested, and maybe nobody is, sorry, it is possible. Last I checked, there was a craftsperson, I believe out of Virginia, who was still making original carpet bags, which is kind of cool. Not that you want to do that, but anyway, that was your rabbit hole for the day. Anyway, Back when they turn around, went home in 65, when Lincoln is then assassinated, March, about a month later, no one's in session. So they all rush back to Washington, but rushing back, if you've got to do it by ship and by train and all that, takes them a while to get there. Anyway, Congress, therefore, today is still in session, but they've been on break, and they're not due to come back until April 13th. So because they are still in session, that means that each day somebody gavels in the House and then gavels it out just to say, hey, we're still here, but they're really not here. When that happened today, the Democrats were there and ready to try and force a vote on the war in Iran. And the Republican who was in it, anybody can have the gavel, not literally anybody, you and I can't, but whoever has been designated to gavel the House in, then gavel the House out, it can be any member of Congress. So a Republican in this case. So the person gavelled them in and then gavelled them out instantly without recognizing the Democrats. But all that to say that the Democrats have shown up to try and stop this war. They have gone back to Washington, both in the House and in the Senate, and they are trying to stop what's going on, and they're trying to get Trump out of office because he is nuts. So what does this mean going forward? Keeping pressure on your electeds, keeping pressure on your state governments not to mess around with the vote for the fall. It means talking to your neighbors. It means posting on social media your dissatisfaction with what's going on. It means writing to your local newspapers. It means making noise, but because what is happening is unacceptable. But more than that, as I say, it's time to be moving forward. And more than that is, although that's crucially important, is to do something that I don't think we talk about enough. And that's that everybody keeps writing to me and saying, what laws do we need to change this? How do we make this stop? And all these sorts of things. We don't really need to change any laws to start. We need to enforce the laws on the books. We have laws against ICE agents breaking and entering someone's home. That's a Fourth Amendment violation. It has never been done before. The courts have always said that you have to have a judicial warrant to do that. The administration just said, nah, never mind, we're just going to do it. We can speak up and say, stop that. There's a law against that. We can insist that our laws are enforced. Same with corruption, and same with all the ways in which this administration is destroying who we are as a nation of laws. Those laws exist. They need to be enforced. That right there is a really important start, mind you, for reclaiming our democracy. That's not going to be enough, and not because people in the past necessarily screwed up, but because going forward, the 21st century has the issues of climate change and the internet, which are going to require new laws and new approaches. And the things that have come from that as well, the migration and the disease as well, is going to have to be addressed in new ways. We can do that. But I think the idea that we have to start from nothing and build up frightens a lot of people because it seems so huge. But we don't have to do that. We have to start with what we had and insist on that being enforced. And if you think that sounds like a weenie approach, think of what this world would look like if Ford hadn't pardoned Nixon, or if the Republicans had been willing to go after Ronald Reagan for the Iran-Contra affair, or if people had actually not let Donald Trump get away with as many things as he did as he was coming up through business, because he always engaged in lawfare, not paying people and so on. There's a reason that we are a nation of laws, because if you enforce those laws, you make other people say, well, maybe I shouldn't do that because I don't want to go to jail. And what we've got going on right now with this administration is the opposite, because so many people are getting away with so much stuff. Everybody thinks, well, I better cheat too, or I'm going to get left behind. And one of the things that we can do is insist at the local level, the state level, and the national level that our actual laws be enforced. Does that mean they're going to be? Not in the short term. No, not with this Department of Justice. But we need to remember that that exists and that we had that for 260, no, what are we at? 230 years. And it's only recently that we have tossed that idea out the window, because for those of us who are, over 50 years old, can remember when the Republicans went to the White House and told Richard Nixon he had to resign because he had broken laws. That's in my lifetime. We had that, and we could have that again. So that's something worth paying attention to and worth really focusing on right now. But also, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be with people, to build community, and not necessarily around politics, although that often comes up, but reinforcing those community ties that remind people that we are all in this together, especially across ages and across genders and across races and across regions. We can rebuild this country from the ground up, which is where it really has to be built up. And that is, of course, good for everybody who's freaking out in this moment, because there's nothing worse than being alone when you're freaking out. You want to be with people. But a crucial part of that, when somebody asked me, it made me think about this, is I've been away, and somebody asked me what people did in the late 19th century as they were losing their democracy to the robber barons, and especially in the North, and then to the white supremacists in the South. Like, how did they cope with that? And the answer was art and music. The music that brings people together, and the art that changed so much of the way we think about American art. So, and again, I'll do one more little rabbit hole. Think about the explosion of jazz in the late 19th century, a truly American music, and ragtime, that it's a mixture of jazz and some of the other stuff that was happening in the West at that time. Two brand new kinds of music coming out of the American South. And of course, the movement of blues out of the late 19th century, into the early 20th century, up the Mississippi River to Chicago, which is how Chicago becomes such a crucial blues city. And not just that, in that period, there is extraordinary art. So the real heartbeat of American sculpture, but also of new kinds of paintings, so that we have really important art exhibits in the late 19th and early 20th century that change the entire landscape of the way American art works. And we get new architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright is actually operating as early as 1893. He makes the gates for the 1893 Columbian Exposition. He's a very, very young man at the time. But you had in the Columbian Exhibition of Chicago of 1893, you had, just all sorts of things that were not political themselves, although the thing was absolutely imbued with political meaning, but that it showed people creativity and art and new kinds of thoughts and new kinds of music and new kinds of ways of being. And you will notice I didn't say literature there, because one of the biggest changes in the United States in terms of art and understanding in that period is new literature. It's a new kind of literature, because the Civil War means we're going to have new kinds of literature, and it takes a while for people to get their feet under them. But with the publication of U.S. Grant's memoirs, which is a really realistic version of what happened during the Civil War, you get the rise first of realism and naturalism in American literature, but sort of a really careful observation of humanity in that literature. And once you had started to observe Americans really closely through people like Theodore Dreiser, then you could start to examine the holes in that life and then begin to invert it. So by the time you get to somebody like Gertrude Stein in the 1920s, you get her playing with language, and you get both the sort of beautiful writing of somebody like Willa Cather, or later on uh, uh, Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway. At the same time, you get with the very stripped down writing, you get the much more florid writing of somebody like Faulkner. So from that moment of extraordinary political constriction and fear, people took their energies into rebuilding humanity. And we're in a moment like that. So if you can't deal with the politics and but you feel like you need to be engaged, pick up your flute, or start writing, or pick up a pencil and start drawing, and be engaged in creating communities that way as well. All right. So interestingly enough, somebody just talked about how many trolls there are today. That's because they're under such pressure and they can see things falling apart. They're probably not organic. They're probably a paid group from somewhere, and we'll go ahead and we'll remove them. But learn not to see it, because it's almost certainly not real. And you're going to see more and more and more of that as the election comes closer. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I don't know what I'm going to do for a letter tonight, but do remember today, the 9th of April, is the day that the Confederates surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Always worth remembering that moment. Not the entire Confederacy, by the way, just Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The other two major armies are going to resign over the next couple of weeks. Anyway, it's an important day in American history. And thank you for being here. One last thing for you, though. I told you Democrats were doing a lot. I saw on social media the other day that Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey, was he from the middle of of a train, he posted on social media, "I'm going to Washington. We got to stop this." And so I reached out to him and said, "Thank you for doing this." And because of that, he reached out to my team and said, "I'll come talk about it if you want." And he's super smart. He is super smart and super thoughtful and super principled. So we're going to have a conversation on Friday, tomorrow at 3:00. I think it's set for 3:05. And I don't know what we're going to talk about, but every time I talk to him, I learn stuff. And I urge you to stop in if you possibly can. Otherwise, it'll be posted in all the usual spots. Thank you all for being here, and I will see you probably Saturday. I believe Joanne and I are going to do something on Saturday, but if anything comes up, I'll be here before that. Thank you for being here.